All right, so I'm gonna get right back to this. So now basically what we're going to be talking about now is trying to decipher what our opponent has, and then trying to cater our bet sizing to that. Again, this is the hardest part of the game. Like, if you find if you have the answer to this, like, I should be in your seat and you should be up here telling me what to do, because poker is a complicated game of incomplete information, and this is essentially the piece of the puzzle that you're looking for, trying to figure out what they have, and then what to do against that. I'm going to go over a couple hands here where I try to narrow down what my opponent has, and then one hand where I cater my bet sizing to make a larger bet, one where I cater my bet sizing to make a smaller bet based on my interpretation of what they could have. So basically, the first example is going to be one where I think our opponent often doesn't have very much. Essentially, this hand here I raise with Queen 9 offsuit. One thing about my pre-flop bet sizing, which is just sort of funny. You'll notice I always do like just under 2.01 times the big blind. For some reason, again, just people being irrational, this looks like a lot more than 2,800. So you risk 0.5% more money and get an extra 5 or 10% more folds, because people just see this big pile of chips out there. It's crazy, but like even in these like higher buy-in tournaments, people are just afraid of that big pile of chips on the screen. So I only have about 16.5 big blinds, and it folds around. This is actually a pretty tough table. Like, all these players are quite good. To this player Weezo, and he's an extremely good German player who's I've played with a lot, and he's just very tough to play against. And he calls here out of the small blind. Immediately when he calls out of the small blind, I can make pretty strong deductions as to what he can't have, essentially. Basically, when he calls the small blind, when I raise here, he usually anticipates I'll have something stronger than a Queen 9 offsuit type hand. When I raise into these good players, he's probably anticipating I have fairly strong hands the majority of the time. So basically, when he still imagines I'll have some lighter hands, but basically with essentially all of his pocket pairs don't do that well out of position. The reason behind that is that pocket pairs have pretty good equity against everything. Like, say he has pocket sevens against my Queen 9 offsuit, he's a statistical favorite over me. But also, if we get post flop, when the board comes with high cards that I don't have, I'm going to be able to represent those high cards. When it comes with high cards that I do have, I'll be able to get value from his sevens. And then when it comes with all low cards and he's putting in money, I can often just deduce that he has a pocket pair and fold pretty happily. So being out of, even though he's a statistical favorite and he would have been able to, get me out of the pot by re-raising, there's just so much incentive for him to re-raise with his pocket pairs that when he calls here, he essentially never has one unless he's trapping me with something like an aces or kings. Even trapping with something like tens won't make that much sense, just since he's not going to be he's going to get a lot of bad boards. Like with pocket tens, there's going to be an overcard on the board, I think the majority of the time, and there's just going to be not that many favorable situations. So I would discount small pocket pairs. I would also discount big overcard type hands, something like an ace queen or better. He'll be re-raising here, trying to get me all in for my 17 big blinds. Essentially, not essentially always, literally always. So essentially what he has here, he's going to have a decent number of decent broadways, like king queen, ace 10, sometimes ace jack, but I think he'd usually re-raise ace jack, and then some middle suited Broadway hands, like king jack suited, king 10 suited, ace 10 suited, queen jack suited, a lot of hands like that. And then, so after he calls, the flop comes 10-10-4. So basically, based on the hands I described pre-flop, essentially the relevant cards on the flop are any 10 jack, queen, or king. He's going to have, on average between the cards 10 jack, queen, or king, he'll probably have an average of about 1.5 of those cards in his hand. He's going to have, and then if it comes, with 4 cards below that, he's almost never going to connect. If it comes with 2 cards between the range of 10 and king, he's going to hit the board almost always. Like if the board came, say instead of 10-10-4, king jack 4, I think he'll have, a hand on that board, virtually 100% of the time. When the flop comes 10-10-4, it is 2 high cards there, but it's actually, better for me than 1 high card. Essentially, if it comes king jack 4, there's 6 cards he can have in his hand, namely the 3 remaining kings and 3 remaining jacks. They give him a big pair. When it comes 10-10-4, there's only 2, so there's only a third as many ways he'd hit that board as a normal 2 card board. So on this board, he, as I mentioned, he will have a lot of king 10 suited, some ace 10 suited, some jack 10 suited, some ace 10 off. There will be, a decent number of combinations that hit a 10 on this board, but the vast majority of the time, he's just going to have, something like a king jack suited or a king queen off where he has the best hand, but essentially I'm just going to try to make him fold that. So now here, again, going back to bet sizing, I can kind of think about this as, thinking about this as a one street hand, like betting 20,000 into 7,900 is like god awful. Like basically if I just, if I go all in here, he'll just be like, oh, ace 10, okay, I call. And then, I get it in with 1.5% equity or something like that. And that's just really, really dumb. Or he'll just be like, king jack, all right, I probably fold. So, I will still fold out a decent number of hands. And there's actually so many combinations that miss that if my two alternatives were, say, going all in with queen 9 offsuit and then just, folding my queen 9 offsuit and letting him take the pot, going all in might actually be slightly better. But, I hope that no one's just taking their queen 9 offsuit and folding it in any situations here. Basically, since I have the initiative and he usually, the vast majority of the time won't have connected with this board, firing out some sort of small bet to when I have this positional advantage is good. So I elected to bet just 1/3 of the pot, a little less than I raised pre-flop. And now he calls. Essentially, largely what I think he's saying here is he's basically saying, either I've got a pocket pair of 5s or better, or I've got a 10, is basically what he's saying. Really, based on my deductions pre-flop and trying to figure out what my opponent has, I'm virtually certain he doesn't have a pocket pair of 5s or better, and essentially he's got a 10, which is, he probably has pre-flop maybe about a fourth of his total combinations. Either he's got a 10, or he's trying to say that he does have a 10. So now I would guess, on the flop, he's maybe 50% has a 10, 50% doesn't have a 10, or something like that. Now the turn card comes a 10. So now basically in this situation, now there's only so many 10s in the deck, and basically at this point he's, it's becoming less and less likely that the fourth one is his. Basically, this changes this card, even though if whoever had the best hand on the flop will now have the best hand on the turn. It's kind of similar to that 8-2-2-8 board, but what happens here is that essentially this really changes his ratio of bluffs to 10s to weak hands. So down here, this second bullet, I have a table basically saying if he had, since this cuts the number of combinations of 10s he can have into 2, if he had a 1-to-1 ratio of 10s to bluffs, now that's a 1-to-2 ratio. So he went from 50% weak to 67% weak. If he was 3 times as likely to have a 10 as not a 10, now he's only 1.5 times as likely. So he went from 25% weak to 40% weak. And if he was 3 times as likely to have like a hand like king jack, like a weak hand versus a 10, now he's 6 times as unlikely. So he went from 67% weak to 83% weak. Every single one of these, he's just massively more likely to just have a bad hand here. So now here, I think a lot of people would have played this as a 2-street hand where instead of betting say 2,600 on the flop, they might bet half pot, like bet 4,000 into 8,000 and then go all in for 16,000 on the turn. And then essentially, if they're wrong, they run into a 10, they lose their whole stack. As it is here, I bet closer to under 1/3 of the pot, just slightly more than I bet pre-flop. I bet 4,000 into 13,000, around 30%. And now here, basically, what I'm saying is, at this point, when that 10 is out there, he sees that I can value bet a larger number of hands. Like if I had pocket 5s here, hell, if I had pocket 2s here or something, I can continue value betting a hand like this if he's going to be calling me with, if he's going to be calling me with ace jack or king queen trying to get there. So it makes his decisions very, very difficult. And then also he knows that I can be bluffing him. So essentially here, he could check raise me all in, just trying to take the pot down now, in which case, I'll just have a good hand and call him a decent amount of the time. Or he can call and I have that threat of the river bet. There isn't a guarantee that I'll be betting the river, but based on our previous dynamic, it's pretty likely that he is anticipating I'd be betting the river here. So basically, what this hand kind of shows here is more or less just kind of utilizing the information you acquire throughout the hand and being able to deduce he didn't have that many pocket pairs and didn't have that many strong overcards, as well as kind of being fortunate and seeing that 10 halves the number of strong hands he can have, resulted in me being able to get that fold from him. Now I'll go over one where I think our opponent likely does have something, and how I reacted to that. Fortunately, I also have something myself. So I raise, again, 2.01 times the big blind. And this Liv Borie calls. She's one of like a small but growing number of like female players who play at like poker at the highest level. Like there's poker's like 98% dudes or something like that in all these major tournaments. Maybe like 97 or something like that. But basically, when she's definitely a little more like on the tighter conservative side than someone like that Weezo would be. When I raise here, I can immediately start discounting a large number of hands from the range she could possibly have. I think that right off the get-go, I know she's not playing smaller pairs. I think if she had something like a fives or lower, she'd just be folding. With her strongest hands, she'd usually be re-raising. Like with jacks or better, I think she'd usually re-raise, but not always. With ace-king, I think she'd always re-raise trying to get all in. And then she'd call me with like ace-queen, ace-jack, and then a decent number of like suited hands, like king-queen suited, probably ace-10 suited, and then maybe king-jack suited, queen-jack suited, and then also 10s through 6s. So it'll be essentially middle pairs, pretty strong broadways, and then decently strong like suited broadways is essentially and then also some big pairs in there as well. But that's approximately what I would put her on at this point. Now this player Pisagno calls in the small blind. Flop comes 9-7-3 with 2 hearts, 1 club. Pisagno checks. I bet around half the pot. Here it's slightly more coordinated board, so I'm betting more than that like third pot I've bet in a couple of the examples. And Liv calls. Basically, when she calls here, I can now further cut her range apart. Basically, if she had something like the smaller type pairs in her range, like something like a pocket sixes, I think she would fold here. If she had something like overcards that don't involve like hearts or clubs, I think she would fold. If she had say she had something like ace jack of clubs, where she had overcards, where she could maybe take it away from me later if I have stronger overcards like ace king, she'd probably call. But when I have the ace of clubs, that's not really an option. If she has something like ace queen with the ace of hearts, I think she'd be continuing with big cards with the ace of hearts in them. If she has 2 hearts in her hand, any hand with 2 hearts, she's going to be continuing. But with those strong flush draws like ace 10 of hearts, king queen of hearts, I think she'd be raising a lot of the time. I think if she had her pocket pairs like 9s and 7s for 3 of a kind, she might not want like a flush to roll off later, so she would likely be raising those as well. Also, if she had a slow played kings or aces, obviously aces are unlikely, but if she had a slow played kings or aces, I think she'd also likely be raising that. So essentially, when she calls, at this point, I'm more or less thinking she has something like queens through 10s, pocket 8s, or like an ace of hearts queen type hand. So usually a fairly strong hand, but virtually always worse than aces. Turns the 8 of hearts, which is one of the best possible cards for her. I think 8s is one of her most likely hands, and now 8s goes from me crushing it to it crushing me. 10s and jacks now are doing better. If she did just call the flop with a flush draw, I go from winning the majority of the time to 0% of the time. And then additionally, if she had something like ace of hearts queen, which I was doing very well against, now those hands have a good chance of beating me as well. So essentially, in this situation, I think that basically 100% of the time she's going to have something decent on this card. Against someone who's who's very aggressive and plays all their fairly strong hands pretty strong, this would be a decent spot for me to check raise. Check, ensure that they bet with 10s, they bet with ace queen, and then try to get the money in. I think she's someone who might check with some of her weaker hands, so as a result, I wanted to keep the initiative. And essentially, I'm accepting here that if she has a set of 8s, when we only have roughly 1.6 times the pot, that she's going to get my money here. So, there are, based on the number of combinations that I think she can have of say 10s through queens, that adds up to more than the number of combinations of 8s. That adds up to more than the number of combinations of flush draws. Essentially, that's what what I think she'll have, probably 60% or 2/3 of the time, I think. So basically here, what I wanted to do is I wanted to come up with a way of sizing the bet where I basically the 2 factors I'm thinking about are, one, I want to make sure that she thinks if she goes all in, she can make me fold. So I don't want to bet I don't want to bet something like 4,000 where it's such a large bet that if she goes all in, I won't ever be folding, because in that situation she might just fold something like a ace of hearts queen as opposed to shoving it over the top. And then I also want to make a bet that's large enough that if she's just calling, planning on only calling rivers where she improves, she's not going to be doing so very profitably. So let's just say she had, black tens, and I bet 1,500 on the turn. She may just call the turn and then only continue on the river if it comes a jack, a 10, or a 6. And if that's the strategy that she's employing, in that situation, like, she's going to be taking advantage of me because my bet is too small. So basically here, I ended up deciding to bet roughly around 55% of the pot. Here it's a spot where, if she goes all in, there's still plenty of room for me to fold, so she may go all in with a weaker hand. And then if she calls, it's a large enough bet that I am, pushing the equity advantage I have over most of her hands. As it was, she went all in, I called, and she had something where, I'm a slight favorite here, but not a huge favorite or anything, and ended up winning there. Yeah, the one thing I noticed about this last year when I did this, so many of the pots I played, I ended up like losing and getting owned. In this one, maybe I over-adjusted to that. I won each of the pots I'm showing you guys, so it's maybe there's a little bit of like sampling bias maybe. So yeah, they definitely sweet to hold that one. Now I'm gonna talk about a few hands. The fifth one, which is what our opponent thinks we have, and this is what poker eventually becomes once you get over the initial humps of like understanding the very basics. Is he thinks that I think that he thinks that I think, and you play a lot of mind games back and forth as far as what level you're on, what the person's representing that they're representing, and it kind of that's where the psychological aspect of it comes into play. Here I'm going to go over two hands where two hands kind of discussing like what my opponent might think I have, and one of these kind of like relating to the question you asked earlier as far as just being able to take someone out of the pot immediately. Basically, when we're playing poker, it's until otherwise, it's often like you can usually assume that your opponent is trying to make some analytical decisions and trying to go through the similar type thought processes that you are. Often very quickly, you realize that's not the case, and they're just a lot of people just don't think very much. But against thinking opponents, they're often going through similar steps that you would be. And so basically, this hand here, we have like a huge amount of action where I raise from early position. I get re-raised by this guy who's quite an aggressive player, this Ariel Bahia. This player Toucan calls. When Ariel re-raises, he could definitely be bluffing here. But when Toucan calls, essentially he can't be bluffing. Basically, when he calls here, he usually has something where he might not want to get all in, but like he has something good. Like usually this will be something between like nines through queens, ace queen, ace king, strong hands like that. So now I re-raise them. I've got aces again, and then Toucan Ariel folds, so he was bluffing, and then Toucan calls. At this point here, we get a board that's like not a very good board for aces. Like when I was talking through the hands Toucan could have, when he has nines and ten or queens and tens now beat me. Nines and jacks now have a straight draw. Ace queen is top pair, top kicker. King queen, king jack, ace jack. Like everything has some degree of equity here. And now basically looking through his perception of what I have, this is the aspect of him thinking about what I have. He probably thinks I have some degree of big pair or some degree of big overcards, and all of those overcards hit this board. But statistically, ace king is just far and away the most likely hand I can have here. Like if we assume I'm always playing queens and up and ace king this way, there's 6 ways I can have aces, 6 combinations, 6 combinations of kings. There were 6 combinations of queens until the queen came on the board. Now there's only 3, so a total of 15. And ace king alone, there's 16 combinations. So like I can have ace king more than I can have queens or better combined. So essentially, when I get to this flop, when I'm re-raising with those hands, when I usually will have something like a jacks or better, ace king or better, to get to this spot. Usually I'm going to have ace king a large amount of the time, so it's important as against a thinking opponent that I figure out how I'd want to play ace king on this board and can play the rest of my range in a consistent manner. So a lot of people they get aces on this board and they think, okay, we can bet small, we can we can trap them, like we can bet 1800 or something like that. But what's going to end up happening there is you're going to get your opponent who realizes if you had something like ace king where you have enough equity with ace king on this board, you'd want to go all in anyways. Like you can get it in good against ace jack. You might fold out pocket nines. If you get it in against jacks, you're still winning. Enough of the time that you basically need to get it in against pretty much whatever he has when there's less than the pot left. that with ace king you'd want to be going all in here. So with your stronger hands, you want to be going all in as well. And this is kind of going back to what you were saying earlier, that if we pick up the 9,000 chips with aces, that's great. If we put in the 8,000 chips and he calls us off with ace jack or jack 10 or something, that's great as well. Here we're happy with either result. We're not as concerned with just just milking him and keeping him in the pot. So here I went all in, and I guess he probably had something like a jack, so like one of the weaker hands, and ended up folding. That was a spot where I think that I think we're almost more likely to get action from his hands by the all-in bet than the smaller bet. And now we'll go over a hand. This is one I've actually played in a live tournament, where I just converted it as if it was played online. Now basically I'm going to talk about a hand where our opponent probably thinks we're either very strong or very weak, and how to adjust our bet sizing to that. Here I raise with just 7-6 suited from early position, and it folds around to this JD TJ poker. He calls for 1,000. The flop comes king 4-2, king 4 diamonds, and 2 of hearts. He checks, and I bet a little over half the pot, just largely because as stacks are much deeper here, we each have 120 big blinds. I bet a little more than I have in the examples where we might have 30, 50 big blinds, and he calls. So when he calls here, immediately I can decipher a little bit about his range. The one thing I can essentially decipher is that he has a lot of middling strength hands. He'll have a lot of pocket pairs between, say, 5s and 10s. I think he would have re-raised pre-flop if he had jacks or better, or an ace king. And then he'll have a lot of top pair king hands, like king queen through king 10. I think those are some of his most likely hands. Sometimes he'll have a higher flush draw, and then sometimes he'll have something like ace of diamonds jack or something where he figures he has some equity and is calling just because of the backdoor flush draws and things like that. And basically, he does essentially what it comes down to. He doesn't have that many very strong hands. Like, he never has a pocket kings. He would have re-raised kings, aces, ace king, which are some of the stronger ones. And essentially what I'm mostly afraid of is 4s or 2s, or especially pocket 8s are the big hands he can have. But that's a very small percentage of the types of hands he could be calling with. He might even just be folding 4s or 2s pre-flop out of position. Now the turn comes the 8 of hearts, and essentially what I'm thinking here is that he has, from his perception of me, I have a range of hands all over the spectrum. He has a range of hands that's between pocket 5s and king queen. 75% of the time it's in that, it's in a kind of like a more capped range where he always has something, but he never has a huge hand. So essentially what makes the most sense for me to do here is when I have something very good, like when I have ace king or better, bet very large, and then if he calls me, I win a lot. And then when I have some weaker hands as well, I can bet very large as well. And essentially, rather than say betting a third pot on the turn and a third pot on the river and making him risk 6,000 chips to get to showdown, I can bet full pot or more than the pot on the turn and full pot or more than the pot on the river and make him risk 20,000 chips if he wants to know what I have. And there, when I have 3 of a kind kings or I have pocket aces or something, I have the opportunity to win a huge pot if he decides he doesn't believe me. And then if I have something like a 7-6, I can achieve the perfect result of him folding a higher flush draw. If he doesn't think he has odds to call with a higher flush draw, bluffing him off of jack 10 of diamonds when I have 7-6 diamonds is phenomenal, because that saves so many bad situations that could have come up. Or also, if I make him think that king 10 or king queen is no longer good, which is what ended up happening, it's a spot where he knows he's in an uncomfortable situation where he's faced with a huge bet now, and kind of he knows that I know that he doesn't have anything that strong, and it's just kind of a spot where he ends up being handcuffed. And you can really, in poker, you can really utilize your bet sizes when you're deeper stacked in position to take advantage of players who can never have anything that strong. So that's actually the last hand example. And basically, I hope that I was able to cover a decent number of aspects of bet sizing in poker, as far as when to bet big, when to bet small, and which of the 5 factors to be thinking about in various situations. I think now Will is saying we'll take some time for questions if anyone has any. Yep. Pardon me? Yeah, all these hand examples were based on hands where I do have something. The vast majority of hands you're folding. You notice in these hands, I usually had some sort of big pair or some sort of playable hand. Probably 85% of hands you are folding, but here, but in which case, your bet size is 0. Here, it was, like, this lesson was, mostly about the hands in which we are playing. But yeah, the vast majority of poker is folding and then kind of, making the most out of, the finicky decisions when you are involved in pots.
But if you're, like, in the last situation, if he re-raises, would you fold? With the 7-6 hand?
Yeah, if he, so if he re-raises me there, where is that hand? Oh, it's back a couple. Yeah, so if he re-raises me there, I'd fold, like, so basically if he min raised me here, then there'd be like 24,000 in the pot, and I'd be calling like 6,500, in which case I'd call. Usually in this situation, he's not going to be re-raising me that much. Like, essentially, if he had something like a king queen, it doesn't make that much sense for him to re-raise because he's, kind of, just letting, like, if my goal is to win a bunch of money when I have aces, he's just making that goal easier for me. And then if he has something like a pocket fours, like, if he was able to slow play that on the flop, or more specifically pocket eights, where he called the flop, spiked the 8 on the turn, if he has pocket eights there, he knows that the big bet is largely coming on the river, so he would rather, let me do that to myself, just in case I am bluffing with a hand like this. So with something like pocket eights, it makes more sense for him to continue trapping me than it does for him to, check raise and, let me possibly suspect he has a hand. So really, I would guess against this specific. This isn't the case against all opponents. Against this specific opponent, and also if roles were switched and I was in his shoes, we probably wouldn't be raising the turn with any hands here. Which is kind of, maybe there's some chance if he called the flop with 6-5 of hearts that he'd try to, re-bluff me off of a flush draw. Like 6-5 of hearts went from being just a gut shot to now a double gut shot and a flush draw. Maybe with something like 6-5 of hearts, he'd just be like, you know what, like you wanted to play, like, I'm all in. Like, there's a chance someone would do something like that, but the vast majority of hands, you're not going to see that very often. So
8-9 of diamonds.
Yeah, something like 8-9 of diamonds is actually in pretty good shape for him, since he beats all flush draws at that point. Like, if you have 8-9 of diamonds, the only flush draws you're losing to are something like a king 10 of hearts or something. So if he had something like that, it makes a decent amount of sense for him to just call there. And essentially, the nice thing about something like an 8-9 of diamonds, it almost makes more sense to call than like a king queen, because I'm never going to be betting here with a hand that beats 8-9 of diamonds, but doesn't beat king queen. Like, I never have pocket jacks when I'm here. I never have ace 8. I never have king 10. I'm basically, when I'm making this large overbet size, I'm basically saying like, hey, look, I either have something really strong or quite weak. So with something like an 8-9 of diamonds, it makes more sense for him to just be calling there. Because like if he's making that re-raise there, a decent chunk of the time I'll just be like, all right, like aces, like I call it, and then he'll just get it in with 30% or 28% or something for a massive number of chips, which is something you usually wouldn't want to do. Any more questions or? All right.
Does your bet sizing change based on where you are in the tournament? Like, say you're on the bubble and you get aces early position, and you really want to play it, but you think if you make a large bet flop, no one's going to call?
Definitely the stage of the tournament is another factor to take into consideration, which is I guess the one thing I didn't mention here is simply your opponent's tendencies are also something you should take into account as far as your bet sizing, but that's that could be several lessons in itself. So basically everyone's tendencies will change based on the dynamic of the tournament. Also, beyond just being a bubble, if it's a bubble of a tournament where the money is meaningless to them, the bubble will be less substantial than if it's in a major tournament, which they might only get one chance in their lifetime to play a bubble like that. It really depends by how much people will be altering their play, but absolutely, in the bubble of a tournament, playing more conservatively with your strong hands and more aggressively with your weak hands against opponents who will be overly timid is a super valuable strategy. Yeah, good question. All right, I guess that's it. Thanks.